Hi, and welcome to Jules Voto's Photo Focus. In this video, I'll be explaining why I think Nikon's 70-200 2.8S Z-mount lens is a good substitute for a macro lens. The 70-200 is a very versatile lens. In my last video, using the 2x teleconverter, I explain why I think it's a good lens for wildlife photography. My normal use for this lens is for portraits, event photography, and so forth. And it works great for those applications. Now this lens at 200 millimeters will focus as close as 3.28 feet from the focal plane. Now, and that will give you coverage of the subject 7 inches wide. So at its closest distance, you can fill the frame with a subject 7 inches wide. Now you could get even closer by adding some accessories, such as extension tubes, such as these Velo extension tubes. There's a set of 120 and 112 millimeter tube, which gives you 32 millimeters of extension. Or you can add a close-up attachment, a close-up lens to the front of the lens. It screws into the front threads. And these things will get you even closer. And with all these things, I think this lens works great. Now you could even get closer at shorter focal lengths on this lens. For example, at 70 millimeters, you could focus as close as 1.64 feet. And at 105 millimeters, you could focus to 2.23 feet. Now, the image size that you could cover, however, at each of those focal lengths at the closest focus distance is about the same, 7 inches wide. So if you want to get closer, we add some extension tubes. So for example, adding both of these tubes. Now there's a 20 millimeter and a 12 millimeter here. These are the Velo tubes, which I did a video on several videos ago, so you could look that up, and I'll put a link in the description below. But by adding these two extension tubes, you can cover a subject 3 inches wide, okay? So it's approximately half life size at 200 millimeters. The other thing, covering a subject that small, normally with a normal macro lens, or a 50 millimeter macro or a 105 millimeter macro, you're pretty close to the subject. With this setup, with the two extension tubes, I was 13 inches from the front of the lens shade to the subject. So that gives you plenty of working room if you need to add lighting, okay? So next thing I did, kept the extension tubes on, and I added this great close-up lens. It's Canon's. It's a 77 millimeter, so it screws right into the front of the lens. It's Canon's 77 millimeter close-up lens 500D. Now, I don't know if these are still, I looked it up, but I couldn't find them new. You will find them used, okay? So I screwed this into the front, so now I got the extension tubes and the Canon close-up lens. And I was able to cover almost, I was able to get to almost 1-to-1. I covered a subject approximately 1 3/4 inches wide, filling the frame. Okay? And at that point, the subject to the front of the lens hood was 7 inches. So again, I still had some nice working room. So that is the advantage of a longer focal length macro lens. You are not right on top of your subject. The disadvantage of this lens is its weight. And when shooting macro, you're almost always going to be using a tripod. So add the weight of the tripod to the weight of the lens, and you got a pretty heavy combination. You know, trying to carry that around with you if you're going to go on a hike or something, it is a disadvantage. But one big advantage of this lens, or any lens with a tripod collar, is that tripod collar. Now, Nikon's 105, Nikon makes a great 105 macro in Z-mount. They also make a 50. And the 105 is a great lens, but it doesn't have a tripod collar. Now, Canon makes a great 100mm macro that does have an accessory tripod collar. So what's so great about the tripod collar? I mean, you could have, if you want to go from horizontal to vertical, you could put an L bracket on the camera. But I think having a tripod collar on the lens makes it so much easier to go from horizontal to vertical. And the other thing that you don't have with the L bracket is anywhere in between. Maybe you want to tweak your composition a little bit. You need to put the camera at an unusual angle, and you can easily do that with the tripod collar. So that's why I like this. Again, the only real disadvantage I see is the weight. Now, is the quality of this as good as a dedicated macro lens? Well, I no longer have a 105. I used to have the F-mount 105. And without looking at them side by side, honestly, it's hard to tell, but I think the image quality with this lens is excellent at any distance. I'm sure this Canon close-up lens will degrade. Anytime you put something on front of the lens, it may degrade the image quality a little bit, but really, I don't think it's noticeable with this. Of course, your depth of field is limited, very limited, and you want to make sure you focus accurately before determining, well, this lens isn't sharp or this combination isn't sharp. You know, make sure you focus carefully because there's such limited depth of field the closer you get. So we're going to look at some images. I'm going to show you some images with the various attachments, extension tubes, the close-up lens, the lens without any extension, just a few subjects I shot around the house. And so let's look at them. Okay, in this first image of this figure, the lens was at 200mm and at its close focus distance, and the subject was 29 inches to the front of the lens shade, and the aperture was at f8. Next, I added the 20mm extension tube, and again at the closest focus distance at 200mm at f8, and the subject was 18 inches from the front of the front of the lens shade. Here I just flipped the lens to horizontal, again with 18 inches to the shade. Again, an autofocus. Autofocus was used for all of these images. Okay, so next what I did, I just changed the subject. The focus was on the serial number, again in horizontal. The lens was 20mm from the front of the shade. Again, the zoom was set to 200mm, and this shows the importance of making sure, especially with the subject like this, that it is perfectly parallel to the camera, because the right side is not as sharp as the left, where the point of focus was. Okay, this image is a different subject, and camera again horizontal, 18 inches to the shade with the 20mm extension tube at f8. Then I added the 12mm tube to the 20 to give me 32mm of extension, and that brought me to 13 inches from the front of the shade. So you can see it gets you a bit closer. Again, shot at f8. Next, I added to the 32mm of extension, I added the Canon close-up lens. That got me 7 inches to the front of the shade, to the stamp, and this was shot at f11. Okay, now these final two images of the silk flowers, I removed the Canon close-up lens and just kept the two extension tubes. So I had 32mm of extension, and you could see the great sharpness, this, at least in the center of the image where the point of focus was, you could actually see the texture in the silk flowers. And most cases, you will use manual focus for close-up photography, especially when you're in that macro range. But I just relied on autofocus for all these pictures. And one of the nice advantages of mirrorless cameras is the fact that there are so many focus points available, and you could choose the exact spot on the subject that you want to focus on in most cases. The Nikon Z7 has close to 500 focus points, so that gives you a lot of options as to what point on the subject you want to focus on. So I think that's an advantage to mirrorless cameras. Now, of course, always keep in mind your depth of field is very limited in close-up photography, and all these images of the flowers, the two flowers, were shot at f11. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this video. As I said before, this is a very versatile lens. There's so much you can do with it: wildlife photography, normal portrait, event type photography, and now I've determined it's actually very good for close-up photography. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And tap that bell so you'll be alerted anytime I come out with a new video. And I usually publish a new video every Wednesday morning at 11 a.m. So I will talk to you then.